I'm ready.
Okay, well, wait a second. Let me just introduce you briefly. I'm Kathy Weymouth, and I am a member of the Friends of the Holderness Free Library here in Holderness. And this is our third Thursday talk. And tonight we welcome Sid Lovett, who joined us in early October and shared with us who's who in Holderness going into the past. There were many, many unanswered questions that came to him via email and letter and phone call following that talk. So we've invited him back to share more stories with us and answer some of those questions. So welcome, Sid.
Thank you, Catherine. I want to thank those people who not only asked questions after our last session, but also brought new information to the subject of tea parlors in Holderness. I must confess, I'm not aware of what Georgine Fabian told us about her property being known as the Poplar Tea Room. I did know of the tea room that's at the corner of Coxborough and College Road that goes down to Route 3. And there's another one that was also mentioned as being a tea room. We have to look at that. I'll have to do some more research as to whether that generation really went to have tea at 4 o'clock, as the tradition says. Today I want to talk about the clergy who have inhabited the Squam region lo these many, many years. But I do so with some hesitation because I have over 50 names of people who have served the church in various capacities. And I also want to make absolutely certain that I don't believe that clergy are the most vital portions of the church leadership, because lay leadership is critical, as you will see in the tradition of Shikarowa Island. But we want to start with Shikarowa Island, which was to become a worship center after having served as the location of the first boys' camp in the nation for probably maybe a decade, thanks to the Balch family. The Balch family ended up owning the island, and the marriages that they achieved, both the women and the men, led to the creation of the Shikarowa Island Worship Center, which was led by Channing Gray. We want to make sure we get that right. It's Channing Gray, no, Clifford Gray Twombly. Clifford Gray Twombly was married to one of the Balch daughters, and together with his sister-in-laws and brothers-in-law, they organized themselves to have Sunday afternoon worship services on the island. Twombly was an incredibly gifted person. He had been the captain of the Yale football team in 1896, had been ordained into the Episcopal priesthood, and his first church, or early church, beginning in 1902, was the Episcopal Church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Twombly is what we would call today a liberal pastor, wanting to transform the world in the neighborhood where he lived. And apparently the Lancaster County, the county seat, was a place where both prostitution and alcohol were the leading deterrents to the good life. And Twombly threw himself headlong into that crisis and was there for decades as the pastor until 1942. Twombly conducted the services in the afternoon, and in 1942, there was a transition from the leadership of Twombly to lay leadership in the form of Dr. John Burke from Rockywold, Deep Haven, and George Saltonstall West of True Farm. They became the president and vice president of the association. And in the transition from Twombly, local pastors and deans were utilized to conduct services, which they transformed to 10:30 on the Sabbath. Some of those people were certainly Henry Washburn from Rockywold, who was the dean of the Episcopal Seminary in Cambridge, and Richard Preston, an Episcopal priest most notable at Worcester, Massachusetts, and Malcolm Taylor, Tink Taylor's father, who had an administrative position with the Episcopal Church in Boston. These people held the fort as the transition to lay leadership emerged. It was my understanding for years that no clergyman would ever be on the board of directors, which was changed only once and perfectly properly to Jim Crawford, who served as the pastor of the Old South Church in Boston, which had a most distinguished, and he had a most distinguished career in serving the social needs and concerns of the city. It was an amazing transfer to two very strong individuals, Dr. Burke, who was an eye surgeon in Washington, D.C., but who spent his summers at Rockywold, and George West, a broker from Boston, who stood 6'8" and was just enormously powerful, and I would have to say opinionated. The transfer to the selection of pastors began, and we would remember some of them that were very helpful. Now, we want to also indicate that Dean Washburn from Rockywold was clearly one of the 10 Rockywold pastors that we would take note of very briefly. There was George P.T. Sargent from New York, Lewis Pitt, Hubert Wood, Joseph Sizoo, Carl Munker, Bobby Bryan, Edgar Lockwood, Ted Gleason, and Susan Iser. There are 10 strong pastoral types and others. Sizoo was a chaplain at GW. Ted Gleason was also the headmaster of Noble Greenough and wrote several very important books, and was always in support of the Church Island and the tradition of Squam. Then there were the older generation is the one that I want to talk about more deeply, because they had the influence, and one can see the influence cast a shade or a light on their children, because some of these folk that I'm going to talk about are the head of at least 3 or 4 generations of other clergy who have summered here and have enjoyed Squam. One of the things that made it possible for them to come in the 20s and 30s is that teachers, professors, and clergy of larger parishes had a 2-month vacation time. I want to depart just briefly to indicate why I was able to have a long vacation, 10 weeks. It wasn't because I was a huge and successful and prominent church, but it was prominent in certain ways that, namely, the congregation wanted to be preaching themselves. And so they were happy to let me go for have a long summer vacation so that they could take over the pulpit at Rock Spring, Arlington, and share their insights, some of which are still readable. Uh, President Eisenhower's speechwriter, Bryce Harlow, or one of the founders of the internet, General Betts. These were all laymen who wanted to get up and speak in front of a church that I had some reason to believe was running the government. But that's just a personal aside. What also happens in the habit of pastors and teachers is that they built these little tiny houses around their property where they would retreat to do their writing, allegedly. And that was very common, both on Mooney Point, on Shepherd Hill, these little places. Harold Taylor, the president of Sarah Lawrence, wrote in the stable of his house. Larry Frank had a place, had a study where Margaret Mead did her major writing as well. But I want to talk about one of the early rivals here in the 30s was a clergyman called T. Guthrie Spears from Brown Memorial Church in Baltimore. Uh, his generation, my father's generation, had, in a sense, taken various different views regarding our participation in the First World War, all the way from conscientious objection to Guthrie Spears, and uh, who served as a chaplain in a division largely featured with Iowa soldiers. Guthrie Spears, as a chaplain, received the second highest military award offered by our country, the Distinguished Service Cross, for going out into no man's land and lugging back the wounded to the trenches. And he was capable of lugging the wounded back to the trenches because he was the champion hammer thrower at Princeton University before becoming ordained by through Union Theological Seminary, and then on to serve in the parishes of New York and then Baltimore. I was deeply touched when Uncle Guthrie, as we called him, noted that in the spring of 1919, he went to Iowa and walked through the lush spring growth to the homes of those who had lost a son in his division. And I've always thought that really was one of the great gestures of care that he exhibited in his whole life. And of course, his son, my contemporary Guthrie Jr., and then Guthrie's two children, Sam and Tom, continue the tradition of the Spears family. Another Spears was Ted Spears, Guthrie's younger brother, who served the Central Presbyterian Church in New York City. And he and Guthrie, along with Jack Mead and Uncle Morgan Noyes and my father, were a fivesome, often climbing in the White Mountains. Ted Spears lost his only son in the Second World War, and was deeply affected by that naturally, and was later to become the chaplain at West Point, where he completed his ministry with great distinction, and was very helpful to me personally when I had a situation of a parishioner that needed some assistance at the West Point. One of the early preachers on Church Island was also Albert Buckner Coe, who came from Oak Park, Illinois, to his home on College Road. Dr. Coe was married to one of the Chalmers family. And here's the most remarkable tradition. The two Chalmers sons, that's Alan Chalmers and Burns Chalmers, had a sister, Catherine, who was married to Albert Buckner Coe. Their three children became pastors or teachers. Chalmers, Buckner, and Ansley was the president of Bangor Seminary. And then their children have also continued in the ministry. But Albert Buckner Coe, driving east to spend the summer here, was always the subject of great interest as to how they made it in their car traveling 1,000 miles when it was very common to have tire blowouts and other problems en route. We all loved not only the tennis competitions that they had, but also the stories that they brought from the Midwest. The Chalmers sons, that is, Alan was pastor of the Congregational Central, the Temple Church on Broadway, was a liberal preacher, and I think on the tennis court, along with my father and Uncle Morgan Noyes and Fay Campbell, the four pastors and chaplains fought it out, not always happy with the attitude of either winning or losing. Burns Chalmers, Alan's younger brother, was the class of 25 at Yale, All-American lacrosse player, and entered the ministry again by way of his marriage into the Quaker leadership of Philadelphia. And Uncle Burns worked for the Friends Service Committee, particularly interesting when in 1940 the Friends Service Committee achieved an acceptance of their proposal to have a delegate in Marseille, France, to work on the refugee issue that was happening as not only Jews and Catholics and others were trying to flee Germany through France and get to Spain. He became friends with a French Protestant minister named André Trocmé. And Trocmé was anxious about whether he should be drafted along with his parishioners to go into forced labor camps in Germany. Uncle Burns persuaded Trocmé that his church at Le Trombon should become a church of welcome to the refugees who were streaming across France, and that his ministry there would be far more valuable than being in a German labor force. Trocmé accepted the challenge, and you can read about it in the book called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed, which tells an incredible story of how these French Huguenot Protestant families received Jewish and other children and welcomed them into their homes and hid them in the forest and in the barns when the German patrol or French Vichy government was trying to find them out and send them off to the concentration camps. Uncle Burns was just a remarkable person, and he and Aunt Elizabeth worked for the Friends Committee in Washington with great distinction. Uh, I must remember Mrs. Coe, Aunt Catherine, who provided many, many Sunday dinners here during the war when families were not able to be together. Uh, when I went to visit her one time at the United Church Homes near Concord, the our conversation was interrupted by a nurse who told her that it was time for lunch. And Catherine looked up with her smile and said, "Well, you know, uh, this place is filled with rules, and I've not been a rule follower, I've been a rule maker. And it's difficult for me to enjoy all that goes on here under the eye of the nurses." Now, there are some other names that need to be tossed in. We had Wally Anderson, who lived over near the Spears, and his son, Wally. We had Kingsley Van Winkle, who family bought much of Harvard engineering camp's property after the war. And Kingsley Van Winkle was an active Episcopal priest at Trinity Church, Hartford, but it was always part of the Squam community. There were some educators, teachers, Jess Trotter from the University of Virginia Theological, Tom Durr, the owner of Kimball Island, who taught at Smith College, and then John Hurd, who taught theology at the University of Toronto. We give them a high hand and cheer. Other pastors that showed up at Church Island were Gene and Sidney Lanier. They were Episcopal priests. He had been active as a pastor in Los Angeles with particular interest in the theater. Then we also have John Wolverton, an Episcopal priest who taught at the Virginia Theological Seminary and once abruptly counseled me to stop picking on him when I thought I was pretty smart in saying that he should become a pastor and discover the real life. He did become a pastor over in Portland, Maine, but he took me to task for being a smart aleck. John was also the publisher of an Episcopal quarterly that dealt with the history of the Episcopal Church, particularly in this country. Then we drift over towards the Ossapies when you get into Arthur and Roy Rauner. The Rauner brothers were sons of a distinguished pastor of the Brooklyn, New York church. And Arthur, I had known at Union Seminary and did me an inestimably good deed when, during a very brief visit to Minneapolis, their local baseball team won the 6th game, forcing a final 7th game. I called Arthur and said, you know, do you have a ticket to the 7th game of the World Series? He said, yes, I have one for you if you'll show up at such and such a place. And so we watched Sandy Koufax absolutely crush the Minneapolis team, it was just like going to a funeral. It was so quiet. Roy Rauter taught at Boston University Theological Seminary, and interestingly enough, asked me one time to come and talk in response to Jack Taylor, the son of General Taylor, on the subject of courage. So I was really just a kind of a second-rate filler in to question Jack, who had been a member of Rock Spring Church. It was interesting that he gave Robert E. Lee uh, a little bit of a darkened picture for lack of courage in telling the Confederates early on or earlier on that the war was over and unwinnable. Uh, I retreated to what I thought was the best contribution to the subject to Paul Tillich's book, The Courage to Be, and I still think that that's worth reading and ruminating about. We have then another strong candidate in my generation was Goldthwait. Remember, that's not a name common today. Known as Goldie Sherrill, whose father had been the presiding bishop of the National Episcopal Church, and his mother had been part of the High Haith family in the original ownership of that kind of peninsula that sticks out into Squab Lake, kind of backed up by Red Hill. Goldie Sherrill distinguished uh, himself, in my judgment, by uh, serving distinguished ways in Ipswich, where one of his friends, John Updike, was very well known as a budding writer. Goldie also showed up at Selma during the first march and also joined the march on to Montgomery and was joined in the first part of that trade by young Guthrie Spears as well. And so they get a kind of high medal mark for their participation. You have Pete Woodward, former headmaster at Holderness School, has been preaching on Church Island. Incidentally, this is a great book. I'll hold it up for you. It's called The Reflections, Chicago Island Chapel. It was put together in 1993 on the 90th anniversary of the island, but it gives you the total picture of who preached there, who conducted different baptisms, and it also reminds reminds us that the lay people have carried the major responsibilities, and for those of us who have benefited from participating as pastors in baptism, funerals, and weddings, owe a great deal to the work of the West family and the Coolidge family, the Webster family, and the Rocky Wool Deep Haven, the Howes, and the Twombleys. They all added up to making it a great spot. And some other names of newer generation, we would have to include Rich Weymouth, my son-in-law, who's formerly the chaplain at the Holderness School, and used to take one of their classes. I guess their senior class would go to Church Island every year for a very special celebration. And then you have from another part of the lake, Jennifer Beal, who serves as an Episcopal priest on the West Coast. Now I want to go to Morgan Phelps Noyes, who was my father's closest friend. Uh, by reason of their sharing the experience of Pine Island Camp in Belfast, Maine, Yale, Union Seminary, and then uh, not long thereafter, uh, Uncle Morgan was invited to build a house, as my father said, just a stone's throw from the tennis court, where all this theological tennis was performed in many different ways. Uh, Uncle Morgan was at that later point was a Presbyterian pastor in Montclair, New Jersey, and he had taken, interestingly enough, a little pastoral care of Rollo May, who had graduated from Union Seminary, and then after spending a year in Switzerland studying with Carl Jung, Rollo May came back to this country to serve a congregational church in Verona, New Jersey, which was kind of one or two steps removed beyond Montclair. Uncle Morgan kind of kept an eye on Rollo, and Rollo discovered that Carl Jung wasn't really going to be exciting the burghers of Verona. So he immediately, after 2 years, went off to Columbia to become a psychotherapist and did a wonderful job. Came back here in 1950 to buy a house next door to us on Coxborough Road and to be a good neighbor and friend for probably 45 years. Now, in the summer of 1946, there was an effort led by Luther Weigel, the dean of the Yale Divinity School, and others, to put together a new interpreter's Bible, 12 big volumes that would have on one page two versions of the scripture up the top. Then halfway down, there would be what the fancy word is exegesis, which is the textual study. And then at the bottom, they would have on the bottom page an exposition. That is, what does all this mean? Largely printed and published by pastors and theologians. Now, there were 4 persons here at Squab who were part of this rather epic effort. My father was asked to do an exposition of the book of Amos in the Old Testament. The Uncle Morgan was asked to do 1st and 2nd Timothy in the New Testament. Ted Spears did Zechariah of the Old Testament, and Joseph Sizu of Rockwell Deep Haven did the book of Joshua. It was a strenuous effort on my father's part, and I can remember the most gloomy day of his whole summer was the day when the editor called him up and said, would you please add 5,000 more words so that we can have this all syncopated into the page with the 3 different aspects. And my father was very gloomy, and to have to go and figure out how to add 5,000 words to his story uh, about exposition of the book of Amos. But so it went. Uh, I want to say a couple of words about following in your father's footsteps. You've seen this lineage of one person like Albert Buckner Coe with three children, uh, two or three grandchildren, and probably a great grandchild, all in the different forms of the pastoral or academic uh, work. Uh, I think people don't follow in their father's footsteps uh, because they think they should. I think it happens in my family, certainly. There were no conversations, no assessments. It was always somewhat by surprise. And I think that that's the way you have to look at it with what's happened here at the Squam families. Uh, Wally Anderson follows into his father's Guthrie Spears plus two sons. Uh, it's a pattern where I think for me and for others it was that you saw in Burns, Chalmers, in Guthrie Spears, in my father and Uncle Morgan Noyes, you saw something of uh, the meaning of attempting to make life more interpretable and more understanding and perhaps more gracious and spirited. And I think this is what characterizes uh, those who have had the opportunity to come to Squam and to be part of the community. Uh, Other names that come to mind would be Connie Hunter, a distinguished Presbyterian pastor of my generation, and also Tom Cleveland of the family that deal with the great theater life of Tamworth. Tom Cleveland was a distinguished football player at Princeton and came after service overseas. He came back and became coach and teacher at Milton Academy and has continued to be a contributor to the life of this whole community along with his family. One of the earliest of the pastors that I can remember only as a child was Chauncey Goodrich. Chauncey Goodrich lived in a house uh, just after you start down Coxborough Road from the top of Shepherd Hill on the left-hand side, which has a great view of Shikarawa and the Red Hill and even White Oak Pond. Chauncey Goodrich uh, seemed to have a certain means uh, that he had in terms of having a chauffeur and a very fancy car. I don't know what, I can't remember whether it wasn't a Rolls Royce, but it was kind of like a big Lincoln. And the chauffeur stayed at what became a tea house. And Chauncey had been the pastor of the American church in Paris and then came back to live in Bowdoin, Maine. Uh, I could just remember seeing this rather distinguished, slight man uh, who created a home for his sisters as well, who were much more notable in terms of their understanding of weaving and textiles. The Holderness Historical Society uh, has one of the Goodrich sisters' collection, and so she uh, grew up. I think neither of his sisters married, but they became very active uh, participants in the Holderness community. But Chauncey Goodrich clearly was one of the older group who, if you read the book Squab, you'll discover a fairly accurate uh, transition story about how uh, Yale Scientific or Sheffield Scientific School professors settled here on Shepherd Hill. And other professors settled around the lake, including Ellsworth Grumman and Ralph Gabriel, among others. Uh, the, the, the living of the, the world of nature, uh, which is well documented in John Wolverton's portion of a remembrance of that 90 years, is an important symptom of what qualifies as our region. There are other aspects that should be looked into besides the tea rooms, which I'm not wildly excited about wanting to find out, except I wonder whether Ruby Davison served tea at the Holderness Inn or at other of the large inns that, and the Asquab House and Hotel, worth looking at. Another area that one might be looked at are the tennis courts of our region, that were largely made by a person who never played tennis, John Greenleaf. If you look at the rocky old courts, the court that my parents created in extending a ring toss court, the Clausen court, uh, the Webster court, all these were done by John Greenleaf using hardpan, which was a reasonably good surface, but made much better after the war when they discovered Antuca and granite dust, because those could be mushed into the hardpan with very good results. So there's a whole history of that. There's another slice of history in terms of lacrosse. I'm not sure that many people know that the head of Wachusett Camp, Bill Triplett, and Buck Thompson, of the founder of Deerwood Camp, were both on the 1932 lacrosse Olympic team, which was being tested out as a possible Olympic sport. And their tradition of another generation of Thompsons, another generation of Weymouths, another generation that have made rather notable strides in the awareness of what lacrosse is up to. So that's our story for today. Number two, we're not sure where we're going to go for number three, but keep testing, writing, and adding your suggestions. And if I've omitted uh, some of your favorite pastors, uh, it's been due to my negligence and but deliberate leaving out of all local pastors and in terms of where they have served in the churches that Church Island, Chicago Island, used to help support, namely Holderness, Ashland, Plymouth, Center Harbor, and thereabouts. So with that, I think I will end today's part two of Holderness in times past and present. Cheers.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't know if there are any questions that people have for you, or again, they can send them to you via text or phone call or letter. Anybody have a question?
Kathy, I do. This is Janet Cocchiaro.
Hello, Janet.
Hi. Sid, could you talk a little bit about St. Peter on the Mount and the pastor was there on Shepherd Hill?
Yeah. St. Peter's was created before the turn of the century, that is before 1900, by the Protestant Episcopal Church. It's a remarkable structure of stone, and the ridgepole, as some of you may remember, is very narrow, pointing way up high, and with wooden pews and an organ and an altar. It was to serve as a summer chapel uh, for the Protestant Episcopal Church. At, at a certain point, the participation of the Episcopal pastors seemed to disappear. And in about, I guess, in the 1930s, Alice Main, the daughter of Charles T. Main, the hydraulic engineer and the owner of the house that Harold Taylor bought and is now kind of lifted up and still a structure of enormous strength. Alice Main was the organist, and she was a Christian Scientist, but somehow she became the manager and the arbiter of services at St. Peter's in the Mount. Services were held in the both afternoon and
You remember going there?
Vaguely.
Yep.
we don't know. We're talking. I could see Hansi Mead. But St. Peter's finally was returned to the Episcopal Church for an attempt to do an afternoon service, but that never really materialized. And so gradually it ended up being put on the market and purchased by Larry Mowbray. And now it's the Burks family who reside in a reformed kind of chapel. The boys from Wachusett used to come by truck to the services. They each were given a dime to put in the offering plate. And most of them dropped the dimes during the service, and you'd hear them rolling around on the floor. And, Alice Maid, with her wide-brimmed hat, left St. Peter's to be the organist at Church Island beginning about 1942, and I think continued for until 1950 as the Church Island organist.
Other questions?
Yeah, go for it, Tim.
Uncle Sid, Bam used to tell us about the group of ministers who used to love to hike. And I was wondering if you had any favorite stories about the hiking.
On the mountains.
I'm not sure I could hear all of that, but
Yes, Sam, take the mask off.
Sorry. So Bam used to tell us that the ministers used to love to hike together. I was wondering if you had any favorite stories of those hikes.
well, the five of that would hike would be the four ministers and your grandfather. I don't know how Jack Mead was probably known as an introvert, so he could tolerate, I guess, the outbursts of Ted Spears, who was an extrovert par excellence, and then the Guthrie Guthrie, Ted, Uncle Morgan, and my father, and your grandfather were often climbing together. It's important to remember the Church Island contribution that the lay people have made, in which your father made many significant contributions to the island. Your grandfather and your grandmother made possible. I can't remember what they contributed in the way of pews or organ or the arrangements, but the lay people have spoken very loudly and clearly, and it's to them that I would want to give credit.
Any other questions?
Pardon?
Thank you, everybody, for coming in and participating in this third talk. Next, I just will say that we thank you, Sid, and there are lots of memories that I certainly were brought forth by your talk. And next week at this time, we have Dr. Daniel O'Neill, who will talk about his new book, Survival of the Fit. And he's our local orthopedic surgeon. Many of you probably know him. So again, thank you so much. Have a nice evening, everybody. Bye-bye.